You're listening to an Anazao Ministries podcast.
All right, what's up, everybody? Welcome back to Systematic Geekology, and welcome to a brand new segment for the show. I think it's become kind of an unsaid thing among SG that I'm not necessarily, some of the stuff that I'm into in my geekdoms, a little bit more offbeat, we'll say. A little bit more off from what is normally the status quo. And so I know that for some of you guys listening, you guys find yourself in the same spot. So we have created Joe's Deep Cut. This is a segment where we are going to find something certainly off from center. And I think we were very successful in finding that in today's episode, and jump into it. And for the inaugural episode, I figured no one better to join me for the pilot of this, the one and only Sari. Welcome back.
Hello, thanks for having me back. I didn't know this was the first one. That's very exciting. Yeah. I'm honored. I'm honored.
So I pitched the episode to Sari, and you came back with Cronenberg. So for those of you that don't know, when we say Cronenberg, we're referring to David Cronenberg, famous within the horror circles, though I would argue that he's more of an action director than he is a horror director, but the things that he's done in horror have been remarkable enough that it's kind of landed him a spot as a notable horror director, you know?
Yeah. And a lot of times the subgenre body horror is used to describe his films, which really emphasizes the sort of psychologically disturbing, biological mutations and things like that. So I'm a big fan.
That's the one thing. So we were saying before we hit the record button that this is the first time in several years that I watched this movie. And I'll be honest, Cronenberg wasn't a director that I necessarily really dug in my youth as a horror head, because I was too busy with guys like Wes Craven, John Carpenter, the big names of horror that were creating stuff. I'm a byproduct. My love for horror is a byproduct of the 80s slasher boom, and then into 90s meta, teen slasher, that sort of thing. All very fast-paced, all very, we'll leave it at fast-paced in comparison to somebody like David Cronenberg, where for me, I always kind of found his stuff dragging, very, very plotting as a kid. So watching it now, I was a little worried when I endeavored into this, because I'm so not a fan of like the Saw movies, or like that whole era that the Saw movie that Saw brought about with that version of body horror, carnage candy, as some of our fellow horror heads call it. And so I was worried about this one. I'm like, because knowing that for most people who know Scanners, they know it for the head popping scene. Mm-hmm. And so, but it's so fascinating to me that for all of its ridiculousness that we'll get into, David Cronenberg is able to take that same premise, that same idea of presenting something on the screen that physically makes you uncomfortable, but tie it up into something that's deeper than just person A getting torn to pieces by whatever it is, you know?
Totally. Yeah, I was trying to analyze this within myself even just this morning and preparing to talk to you about this. Like, there's some kinds of shock value that I'm like, that's awesome, and there's some that I'm like, no thanks, and I wondered if it's like, and I mean, different than you, I'm not coming I'm coming more, Cronenberg has like a real sci-fi sensibility to him, and I'm more of a sci-fi fan than a horror fan. I kind of come to horror through that conduit, to where it's this, like, sometimes the phrase cosmic horror or kind of falls in this same category. But yeah, like you're saying, Cronenberg is always interested in sort of philosophical things, existential things, questions about being human, and about what's what's real and who can you trust? Like, how do we know what we know? And like, and stuff like that. So definitely having it infused with that level of like what's below the surface, using those shocking set pieces to sort of bring you into a state of discomfort, but then use that to kind of ask some more deeper philosophical questions. I like that. But I also wondered if it was just because it's old, and to me now, as someone, born later, this was very shocking, to the audiences when it came out, and to me now I can see very clearly that's not real. That is definitely latex or whatever. Like, like it doesn't look as real to me as some, like when you get later onto the Saw films, and it looks like what actually would probably look like if someone was, getting their head sawed into or something like that. Like, but I don't know. Maybe my kid won't think that looks real. I don't know. I don't know. That would take a deeper dive, but yeah. So it's interesting. It's definitely interesting. I was thinking too. I'll just do, because I'm like this resident Star Trek person. There's an episode of Star Trek that aired like 7 years later where a head explodes, and it's like this very notorious episode of Star Trek: The Next Generation from an early season, like maybe the first or second season, 1988 or whatever, called Conspiracy, where there's this conspiracy within Starfleet, and this guy's head explodes because he's got this like symbiont in his body that's like leeching on him, and it makes his head explode. Anyway, very Cronenbergian episode of Star Trek that almost paying direct homage, I feel like.
That's funny.
Because this movie is Scanners is very conspiratorial too. But anyway, sorry, wandering.
Yeah, no, it took me a second because those early seasons of Next Gen are right when where I started my fandom for Star Trek. So it took me a second to think of the episode that you were referring to. But yeah, now that you mentioned that, that is very Cronenbergian in the way that it's presented.
Anyway.
It's interesting that you bring up the juxtaposition between older horror and modern horror, because I feel like I've always the movie The Exorcist was always the big catalyst for me in this conversation, because I would grow up as a horror head hearing about how The Exorcist was this groundbreakingly terrifying movie for its time and all of this kind of stuff. And again, when the, I guess, carnage, but the colorful MTV version of horror is your first hit into horror, it definitely does something to when you're younger going back and watching something like An Exorcist, because it is way slower, way more toned down, way more cerebral. And as I got older, I could see how it was easier for me to put myself in the shoes of the audience that would be seeing this for the first time, that wasn't exposed to all of this other stuff that would come after it. And that this is kind of the first taste of those kinds of things being presented on the screen in certain regards. And I feel like it's kind of the same for this era of horror, that it's different in its age, and thus I think has to rely on more of the peripheral elements to create the environment, to establish what's going on. Like in that first scene, I one of my favorite parts of this movie is the soundtrack. I think movies from this era, from this time, have some of the best music attached to them. And just from that opening crawl through to the establishing shots, all of that, I think that was really good. But as you're unpacking the scene, you're confronted. I'll use that word, confronted, in the action parts with this piercing noise that they use throughout the movie to establish when scanning is going on. And they do that first before going into the auditorium scene and the explanation of what scanners are and all of that. But it's this really frustratingly annoying noise that comes through. And for me, I felt like it was really there because I was listening to it I was watching it on my computer. So I had like production headphones that are noise canceling and all of that kind of stuff in. And so I'm just boom with this noise. And like, but to me, it struck me in the same kind of way. To compare it to some of its contemporaries, you take somebody like John Carpenter, who did so much with ambiance and music and all of that, and that being my gateway in, I can appreciate the sound and the soundtrack and all of that kind of stuff. And I thought that was really cool the way that he used that, because otherwise, without these kinds of elements, it just looks like people making weird faces into the camera at random parts. You know what I mean?
Yeah, that's always a problem with like telepathic and psychic stuff in movies. It's like the challenge of getting the actors to do something that doesn't seem too ridiculous. The sound definitely helps, for sure. But actually, the actors' faces are kind of also very unnerving and uncomfortable to watch. Yeah. You know, like, what would a man look like if his head was about to explode? You know, like literally feeling, you know, maybe you've had like a migraine where you felt like that was about to happen or whatever. Yeah, right. Very interesting. I agree with you with the soundtrack. But you said this movie, this is your favorite Cronenberg is what you called. So I'm interested to hear what you really love about it besides the score.
Yeah. So this movie, it's my favorite Cronenberg because to me, in comparison to some of his other work, it's a little bit more cerebral in what it asks in that whole brothers and how the different perspectives can be and all of that. Like, I feel like the best parts of this movie are in like the last 10-15 minutes of it. And while there are other movies that I would call more famous of his, you know, for those of you that don't know, this was his I would call this his most famous movie until The Fly came out. He directed the remake of The Fly, and that's kind of, he is kind of known for The Fly. And you know, and even past those two movies, like he is very much I feel like a director of iconic iconic moments. But this in totality, with all of its nonsense, with all of the bad acting, still has the most compelling story to it, where other ones, I think, in that regard, come short.
Yeah, that's well said. I get that. I actually read an article where someone, it was on the Criterion page about this movie, compared it to like a Thor Loki type relationship with the brothers that have been pitted against each other, or even Cain and Abel to get biblical for this show's audience. Right. But the dynamic between the two brothers who don't know they're brothers for most of the film at the end is really interesting, and I don't know, the way that plays out is really interesting, what they represent.
Yeah. Especially when one of them is Michael Ironside. I had forgotten that Michael Ironside is in this movie until we got to the auditorium scene. I'm like, oh yeah, that's right. That is Michael Ironside. And he simultaneously looks exactly the same and so much younger than most of the other stuff that I would know him from, because he was big in the 90s, early 2000s as like mustache twirling villain number 5 sort of thing. He played a lot of that kind of role. And he brings weight to a role that very easily could have been very slapsticky. Like this very much could have come across as vaudeville in its presentation, but he really takes it seriously to the point where, like, by the end, and he's giving his villainous monologue about, you know, let's rule the world together sort of thing. Like, you feel the weight of wanting revenge, and you feel the weight of feeling like he's owed something, and all of that. And like, it's this moment, especially for me, it was interesting. I'm a huge X-Men fan. I think, especially the 90s cartoon and all of that.
Yeah.
And I felt like there have been times where I've read The Mutants and I'm like, what happens if they just all collectively say, screw it, we're taking over? Who you have reality warpers, you have grade A telepaths, you have and it depends on who's writing it. Ultimately, it's a fictional universe, so whoever needs to be strong can be strong in the moment, and yada yada yada. But if you're looking at it from your fan perspective and looking in on the story, you just wish sometimes that they would just say, screw it, we're done getting kicked, we're standing up for ourselves. So like there's moments where Michael Ironside is giving this performance where you're like, I know I'm not supposed to believe in, like, be rooting for you and all of that kind of stuff, but in that like last big battle, you kind of find yourself rooting for him in a way. You know what I mean?
Yeah, definitely. I like going back to the scene that starts the film, and it takes place in this very cool looking mall in a food court, which is like the most mundane of settings, right? Like we've all been in a food court in a mall, you know?
Right.
And the protagonist is there, and later on he describes like I guess he accidentally gives a woman a seizure with his scanning, but because he doesn't know how to control his abilities in any way. But he describes it to the doctor later, who is secretly his father, that she did it to herself. And so it made me just think about like the psychological dynamics. Like psychologists call it something that humans do theory of mind. And even in psychology, they call it mind reading. And it's when you develop the ability to really have a pretty accurate hold on what someone else is thinking, you know, like if if you're being judged or if you're being stereotyped or if you're being condescended to, like we as humans have the ability to kind of make those types of judgments. This, of course, in the film, it's like it's exaggerated to the nth degree to where it's a literal reality, you know, but you know, he's on the fringes of culture. He's a loser. Even like his scientist dad is like, do you want to know why you're such a loser? Why you're such a trash person? You know what I mean? And so he can feel the woman's judgment, and it's almost like he describes it as almost like a natural consequence of her casting judgment on him as like a marginalized sort of countercultural person, that, you know, she just, because he didn't know how to control it yet. He didn't get brainwashed yet. He was just reflecting back to her own ugliness. And I thought that's kind of a cool picture, a cool way to think of it. I don't know. I'm not saying that harm people, but you also shouldn't judge people.
Right. But it's a good point to raise, that like you take something like this, and you know, this movie was based off of a big scandal in the 50s with a drug that was being given to pregnant women that was causing issues and yada yada yada. And that, you couple that with the fact that this movie was being written as it was being shot. The script wasn't done, but when they went into production, and then you have all of those things, and then you can still see the through lines throughout the entirety of the movie. And it's interesting the way that Cronenberg peppers in these different, I guess, moralistic stances, I guess psychological stances, those kinds of things along the way, like in a manner that you would think that this whole thing was plotted and planned out, you know?
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Yeah, I like too, along those lines, when the protagonist, he's told about these bad scanners, these ones that are organizing, like this criminal organization that he's got to take down, like be the good guy, don't be like the other scanners, all the other scanners. But then he finds the group that's led by what's that character's name? Kim? Yeah, Kim, I think is the character. Jennifer O'Neill plays Kim Overs. The group the cell of scanners that's led by her, and they're like this peace-loving community of scanners. And he was like, they didn't tell me about you because they had an agenda, right? They didn't tell me that there were good there are people like me who are good and just trying to explore these gifts together. And then he has that experience where they're all like mutually scanning one another in the circle, and it's just this beautiful moment of like human connection. And in the middle of it, they get gunned down. It's like just what's the peace, love, and understanding, the sort of hippie countercultural moment there. And then they get in the car, and she says, "Now I know what it's like to die," because they were all connected when a few of them got gunned down. It's like, whoa. Dang.
Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah. But he's always, Cronenberg's always putting in those moments. But then also, it's sort of surprising how many big sort of set piece, like big budget moments happen in this movie too. Like when the car flew into the record store, I was like, they just like blew up, set a car on fire in a record store. Like, how much money did they have? And that's not the only car that blows up in the movie. It's pretty
right.
Like speaking to your action director comment.
Yeah, it's funny. You can basically break down this movie into beginning sequences, the establishing the establishing scene where it's the first time you see the ability used. They're in the food court, yada yada yada. And fun facts, that was actually an active choice to put that scene first and then put the scene where everything is explained, because David Cronenberg thought that people would be late to the movie theater. And so he want people in a movie like that, you need the explanation of what exactly is going on. So that was an active choice to put it like 10 minutes into the movie or whatever, however long the first scene takes.
Yeah. Yeah. I read someone said, I don't know, like that some folks were having trouble following the plot if they had the head explode earlier in the film and they pushed it later, because people were so caught off guard were so overwhelmed by seeing that moment that they couldn't pay attention to what was happening in the movie after. So don't put the important plot points after the head exploding. That was like the rule of thumb.
That's funny. Yeah. Yeah, and then that scene happens where they're in this auditorium and it's supposed to be a display of a guy scanning, but then low-key Michael Ironside turns it around on the other guy and makes his head explode. And then you basically move into various examples of explosions and action set pieces to push forward this kind of journey to get to what is ultimately the big confrontational moment between our protagonist and antagonist, which from what I understand, looking into the actors, because I was curious, some of these actors I'd never seen outside of, and generally speaking, in the horror community, there's kind of a crop of actors that play in various movies. So it's really rare to see an actor act in a notable horror movie and then not know them from a single other thing.
Yeah.
And it turns out that right after shooting this movie, the guy who plays Cameron retired from acting and became an incredibly famous painter.
Stephen Lack. I'm just seeing that now. Wow.
Yeah.
That's incredible. Yeah, looks like he's doing pretty well for himself.
Which was an incredibly smart decision on his part, because man, did that guy not have the right calling by being an actor. Like, just with the bombastic nature, I think it's a lot of the issues are forgiven because he's so fish out of water, and his acting or lack thereof it really emphasizes that fish out of water nature that we're going for here.
Mm-hmm.
But like, yeah, his acting abilities were not grade A in this movie, that's for sure.
Maybe it was when he was like doing that scene with the guy who's the artist. Remember, he goes looking for the scanner who is like who's a sculptor, and he goes to the art show, and then he goes to his studio and he's like, you know what, this is the life I want to be in.
That's phenomenal.
Yeah, and I love that guy, just the just the over-the-top metaphor, that guy living in a huge sculpture that's a replica of his own head. Like,
Yeah.
So good. Yeah.
Yeah.
Good for him. He found his true calling. Probably for the best.
Yeah. Yeah. But I mean, it's cool. It's cool that you can, your one outing as an actor that's notable is Scanners, like a movie that lives on, it for better or for worse. That's not a bad, it's not a bad outing, even if it isn't your calling,
Yeah, for sure. Sure.
But yeah, it's funny though, when with talking about him and his acting ability, it's so, the juxtaposition. I found myself really appreciating so for those of you that haven't watched this movie, you can tell that somebody is scanning because essentially what they do is they stare dead into the camera, shake a lot, and then usually you cut to somebody else with a nosebleed. Is kind of how that's illustrated. And it's that subdued, the subdued talking points of this movie, in contrast to everything else going around, I appreciated, even if I can see how the middle portion of this kind of is carried by the action pieces that are going on around it. And for Cronenberg movies, generally, the most important parts are those talking points, because that's where a lot of the exposition happens. That's why the story's told. He very much is that style of director where you have to pay attention when people are talking, otherwise the action pieces aren't going to necessarily make as much sense. But I feel like in this movie in particular, it really works, whereas for me, some of his other movies that do the same kind of formula kind of miss, and they're a little bit more boring or a little bit drier, in total presentation.
Yeah, like what, for example?
So I'll take the other most famous one, The Fly. And with The Fly, there's categorically better acting, but it feels like everybody's trying to be a character. Like, it just feels like you got your acting direction, you got your character direction, and just go. Whereas with this, it almost felt like this was more like real life reactions to things. You know what I mean? Like, this just felt more like people in a really weird situation that were forced to react authentically to it.
Mm-hmm. Okay. So. Fair enough.
Where does this go ahead.
No, go ahead.
Where does this rank for you in comparison to some of Cronenberg's other works?
I'd say I've seen a handful of Cronenberg films, and I love The Fly. I feel like it's just it's a disastrous, like, opera of a movie, just with Jeff Goldblum's body parts falling off. I just really love it, and I think I really love Gina Davis, and I just think she's phenomenal in that movie. So in doing research for this conversation, I learned that Cronenberg has directed 2 movies with the same title that have nothing to do with each other. Crimes of the Future, which was his second movie and is also his most recent movie. So I didn't know about the one from 1970, but this most recent film, Crimes of the Future, premiered at Cannes Film Festival, and people were walking out of it apparently because they were so horrified or disgusted or whatever.
Fascinating.
But I thought it was actually really good, and it does have that kind of slow, subdued energy to it. It's a dystopian future where people have evolved from experiencing pain, so the humans no longer experience pain, but they kind of miss it, and they're going in search of more extreme sort of experiences. And so it centers around this couple that they're artists, they're performance artists, and they do surgery as part of their performance art. So I thought it was really, really good, a really well-made film, kind of slow and thoughtful and philosophical, but with this occasional extreme set pieces, going on. So those two are favorites of mine. There's one from 1999 called Existence that is kind of a good time. Have you heard of Existence?
I have.
Like Existence with a Z at the end. And that is just, it's so very 1999, and there's this like video game virtual reality stuff that they're playing around with. That one's just a good time. And then there's Dead Ringers, which is about evil twin gynecologists. That one is really interesting too. So those are some of my favorites. Of course, there's more serious films he's made, like Eastern Promises, History of Violence, films like that. But yeah, so that's sort of my walkthrough, one of my favorites. So, you asked me where do Scanners rank in all of this. I would say below Crimes of the Future and The Fly. Maybe a few hairs above Existence, and I don't know, The Brood is maybe tied. Maybe it's tied with The Brood. I really enjoy The Brood. Yeah. This I wish that I cared more about the characters in Scanners. I think that's a weakness of that lead actor. He maybe got cast for those eyes, those deep, like blue-green eyes. Yeah. And I also felt like, it's obviously part of this like corporate / like pharmaceutical industry with government contracts, like this like conspiracy system, that everyone's asking like, who do we trust? And countercultural folks are like, you don't trust any of these people because they're all against you, But anyway, I was watching this with my husband, and at one point I was like, there's no women in this movie. There's, we were like 25 minutes in, and I was like, there's no women in this. It had a very like masculine energy, and I was like, is this Cronenberg as a young director sort of focusing on that? But it also could just be kind of a product of its time, where there were like mostly men in these senior leadership roles, so that's what's going to be reflected. And then when Kim shows up, you're like, oh, a love interest, yay, but that's definitely something I noticed, and those are some of the things that made me not connect to the film as much as some others. To me, it's fun and it's campy, and like the technology aspect is really fun, like the ways that computers work, like like he hacks a computer with his mind through a payphone at a gas station, and both the computer room and the gas station blow up.
Yeah.
And the payphone starts melting, like so that kind of stuff is just sort of fun and hilarious and entertaining. But yeah, some of my thoughts.
That's funny. Yeah, I will say, you can. I think the sign of a good director is when you can make various pieces of work and keep people talking. If you can keep people talking, then that means that you've interested people. When it's just as an artist, if nobody's talking, that's where the problem is, because that means nobody cares. And for better or for worse, David Cronenberg makes films that people have opinions about. You know what I mean? And with something like this, like I agree that by the end of it, I wanted that final twist to be that the bad guy won, not that the protagonist won. Mm-hmm. And there's this big climactic moment of the two brothers. You find out they're brothers, and that they were experimented on and all of that, and
trying to scan each other to death, basically.
Yeah. And there's this moment where he's cowered in the corner and takes the blanket off of his face, and it's Michael Ironside, but Cameron won, and
Cameron uploaded his consciousness into his evil brother. Yeah,
right. And like the one character that I really felt like was substantive enough to really get invested in. I would have liked to have seen be the final victor, but yeah, I mean, it's I do find it interesting. Usually with people like when watching a movie, I care about whether or not I care about usually two things. One, does this feel like a world where more stuff is happening than just what's in front of the camera? Is other stuff happening elsewhere in the universe? Also, I care about characters. Just write a compelling character, write a compelling story. That's what I care about.
Mhm.
And this movie, it has a serious deficit of character, but
Mhm.
to me tells enough story that it makes up for it. Whereas I think for some of his other work, it's way more skewed towards the character side than the story side.
Right. Right. I yeah, I agree with you. And Ironside, like, I right away was like, what happened sequel wise with this movie? Because it seems like it sets up for to have the story continue very perfectly. But and there were sequels, but Cronenberg wasn't really involved, and I haven't seen any of them, so I don't
Right.
really care. It doesn't seem like it probably lost its way. But Ironstein had the strength to carry on the story, and to carry the viewer's interest, for sure. One thing I wanted to ask you about that I felt confused about, and maybe it's just unclear, is the demise of the father, because did I just miss something? I thought that because he starts kind of like talking to himself, like all of a sudden you hear his thoughts. And I was like, wait, is he a scanner too? Has he been taking this stuff? And then he just kind of like he suddenly seems like he goes insane very suddenly, and then lets himself get killed.
Yeah.
How did you read that?
I read that as an extension of trying to show off Michael Ironside's capabilities. But
Okay.
I think it was
Uh-huh.
very rushed. I don't think there was a lot of substance to it. Like I could absolutely see a world where you you watch that same scene and you read prolonged exposure to the chemical that's causing,
Mhm,
is
mhm,
then causing
mhm,
its own psychosis and all that kind of stuff. But
mhm.
yeah, I definitely agree that it was not clearly stated, but that's what I got out of it.
Yes, and it was quick, so you're like, "Wait, what?"
Right.
Yeah. Well, a lot of the times I was like, "Well, these scanners need to be scanning a little more proactively." Like, if because at first it's like flooding their minds, like, "Oh, I can hear everyone's thoughts all the time." But then later on, it's like, "Oh, you don't know this gunman's here until he's like right behind you. Like, can't you
Right.
scanners, please?"
Yeah, yeah. It's weird because this movie it generally with telepath movies, they kind of have that's kind of how you see a character introduced to their powers, is
Mhm.
by that flooding of
It's like an
voices and things
overwhelming,
like.
yeah.
Right. But usually that's as kids. Usually
Mhm.
that's all set up, and they do something to establish a an earlier state where that happened, and then how they've dealt with that. And you don't really get that in this movie, and it's kind of that's coupled with scanning ability in this movie is basically whatever you need it to be for each one of the characters. Like there's not
Mhm.
like a set, this is what you can do as a scanner. It tends to change depending on the individual.
Yeah, what needs to happen in that moment, but
Yep.
yeah, which speaks to maybe what you were drawing out about the movie kind of being invented on the fly too, as it, scene by scene what needed to happen.
Yep.
Yeah.
So any closing remarks about this movie?
Um, I guess I wondered if you would want to be a scanner if you could, Joe.
I there at other parts in my life, I think I would have said yes, because I think there's something interesting about the idea of being able to read thoughts and all of that kind of stuff. But with how people act, I'm not sure I want to know what's going through people's minds. You know what I'm saying? So, yeah, I think at this point, I don't think I would want to be a scanner.
I know. I was thinking about that because, like, there is something appealing about it to, not have to guess what somebody thinks about you sometimes, but it's yeah, ultimately it would cause more harm than good. I'm pretty sure. I'm glad the Lord didn't give us that. But with people who you become close to, like, I'm always surprised now. Like, I spent so much time with my partner during COVID. We work from home. We've the last few years we've spent so much time together, and my ability to kind of know where he's at, what he's thinking about, what he's gonna do next is pretty sharp at that point. I'm sure you'd say the same thing about me. So I think that kind of stuff is enough. It's best we don't know that we're not, because we're not, the stuff we don't say out loud isn't said out loud for a reason. And I think that's really important.
Agreed. And I find myself in a similar situation. Like, my partner and I were in a very similar boat. Like, we got married and then went into 2020. And so, like, we got a master's class in education about each other. And I know people that have been a part of my life for long enough that we can read in between the lines. We can read the beats with one another. And yeah, I think at this stage of my life, that's enough.
Good. I'm glad we had this talk.
Yep. All right. So let's go into the wrap up. What recommendations do you have for our lovely listeners? What have you been geeking out on recently?
Okay, what I've been geeking out on recently is the TV series Atlanta, which is on Hulu, and it's maybe just finished its last season, but I'm not caught up. So I'm at the beginning of the current season, and I think the show is so well made, so well directed. It's got just the level of, it talks about race so intelligently and beautifully, and has just the right amount of surrealism for me. It's not exactly like 100% the real world or the way the characters, the stories play out. Really love that. I have to recommend the movie Triangle of Sadness. It is about, what should I say it's about? Most of it plays out on a cruise ship. And it is just the most smart, hilarious movie about kind of class and how affluence and wealth and all these different things, like, everyone says they want equality, but really we want to feel a little bit more special than the other person, the cleaning lady or whatever. And I just wonder about it. It premiered at Cannes, and I just was wondering, like, what must have all these affluent people at this film festival thought when they watched this movie. I feel like it's a movie that maybe I'll watch like a couple times a year to be reminded about what's really important in life. So highly recommend Triangle of Sadness.
Yeah, that's interesting. I feel like with a lot of the film festival movies, people think of film festivals and they think of starving artists, which there's a reality, I guess, to being a starving artist, but that's its own conversation. But the people who are going and attending these things, they're not poor people. Like, they're not. There's no, that all costs money.
They're gatekeepers. They're gatekeepers for the artists, so they have that. That's a privileged position.
Yeah, and so I'm just sitting here processing the stones that it takes to make a movie that talks about the very group that would be watching the movie that you're creating. Like, that's guts.
Yeah. It's pretty powerful. Especially when you get caught up, it's capitalism, right? We get caught up in, like, how successful we can be. How can I get a nice house? Blah, 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 blah. And I'm not saying there's anything wrong with ambition or any of that kind of stuff, but I don't know. That's a movie that's just a really great mirror, and it does it without feeling preachy at all. It's just like filmmaking at its finest, So.
No. For me, I have been geeking out on. My wife and I went back and watched The Bear, which is a miniseries that happened on kind of a miniseries that happened on Netflix, or not Netflix, FX.
That's who. Mm-hmm.
Yeah, and was on Hulu. Yeah. So I am forever going to be sounding the drum for people to watch this movie and then again, comment on this episode that you've watched a series. Comment on this episode that you've watched a series, so that way I can justify doing an episode about the bear. It is a love letter to anybody who's been in the industry. It is one of the most accurate depictions of life in the kitchen that I've ever seen, and it is wonderful in all of it. And so that we went back.
It's very stressful. Most episodes have that frenetic, stressful energy.
Yep.
It's like, okay, I need to come down from that.
There's a reason why I got out of the industry.
Good for you.
But yeah, so it's from the episode. If you guys listened to the episode that we had a guest on, it was Josh and I. We talked about cooking shows, and that kind of spurred me to go back and watch it again. Recommendations. So we found a board game called Boss Monster that if you're into board games, if you're into like I call it the Exploding Kittens era of board games. The card-based, turn-based games like that. It is for people who are a fan of like retro platformers like Mario, stuff like that. It is a card game based around that. And it is phenomenal. It is one of the best games that I have found in recent memory. So
what's it called again?
Boss Monster.
Boss Monster. That sounds like fun. You excited about the Mario movie that's going to be coming out? Have you been keeping up with that? Not excited.
No. I think places need. I think people need to stop. People need to stop casting Chris Pratt. That needs to happen quick, fast, and in a hurry. He's
had his day. I recently watched the Lego movie, the Lego movie. It's like 2012 or something like that.
Yeah.
And delightful. Like that movie's actually pretty amazing. I watched it with my daughter and she was really into it. And I was like, wait, I forgot how good this was. But, that character is supposed to be like the most average Joe of average Joes, And I'm like, that's Chris Pratt. That's perfect. It's wonderful.
That's funny.
Hey, can I do one plug that I'd like to mention
Go
to
for
the audience? In January, this will probably go up real soon, right? This is what we're doing now. Okay. In January, I'm going to be crowdfunding for the next film I want to direct. It's going to be a short film about it's an alien who's hiding out as a winemaker in the Pacific Northwest. So I'm going to be producing that film next year and directing it. And I'm going to be raising funds starting in January with Seed and Spark. So if anyone wants to sign up to get updates about that, I'm really excited about it. I'm really passionate about the project. I can't wait to make it. It's winemakermovie.com. You can go there and sign up. And then once the campaign is live, the URL will take you to the campaign. But if you want to just sign up for updates, I'd really appreciate it. Slash excited. So.
Yeah, that sounds like a really interesting premise. So. All right, guys, and that is a wrap for now. Man, this was fun. Let us know down in the episode or down in the comment section of wherever you find this. Let us know what else you want to hear from these deep cut conversations, because the doors are open, and this is the opportunity to hear about things that are, either older or offbeat. Doesn't have to necessarily be as aged as something like Scanners, but the things that are a bit more off from center, absolutely chime in. Let us know if you have heard this and maybe you're hearing Sari for the first time, or you just find yourself wanting more. Go ahead and jump on over to systematicecology.org. You can find our entire backlog of episodes there. And if you find yourself wanting to help us keep the lights on, you can head on over to patreon.com/systematicecology and toss a couple of bucks in the kitty. And we have a lot of different bonuses. You know, the comic book catch up. We've got drinks with Tejas over there, a whole bunch of stuff for your listening pleasure. But until next time, friends, I want you guys to remember one very important thing. We are all a chosen people, a geekdom of priests.
This was an Anazao Ministries podcast. If you enjoyed this show and would like to learn more about our network, be sure to check out the Anazao Ministries Podcast Network.